In this video, we will talk about steps in the research process. Here are the learning objectives for this week, some of which can be learned about through reading the textbook chapters. The ones highlighted in bold will be covered in this video, and then some of the other ones will be covered in the next video lecture. So for this video lecture, we're focusing on recognizing whether research is empirical and being able to differentiate between empirical and normative statements, and also discussing the advantage of the scientific approach and reviewing how scientists communicate findings. If you have not already done so, I recommend you read Chapter 1 before watching this video. So just to review, the textbook talks about steps in research, both simple and detailed. And I recommend reading through the chapter to get, they do a good job of explaining sort of the detailed steps in research. But just as a review for sort of the simplified steps, because this connects to this idea of empirical research, is that empirical research requires there to be a research question posed, some data collected, and some data analyzed. And through the weeks of this course, we're going to talk about different types of data collection and different types of data analysis in HDF. But this directly connects to sort of what I want us to do as a little bit of a warm-up, is to ask ourselves, based on what we know from reading the chapter, is this research? Why do you think it would be or wouldn't be? Okay. And so I would actually ask you to pause the video now, read through these four points, and choose one that you think, choose at least one that you think, yes, this is definitely empirical research, and choose another one that you think strongly, no, this is not empirical research. So please go ahead and pause the video, think about this on your own, and then we'll come back together and I will walk you through it. So I would argue that clearly numbers 3 and 4 are research. We can imagine that the research question might be something about what are teenagers' experiences with cyberbullying like? How can we understand this? And they make it clear that they collected some data, though they did it in 3 through a survey, and they did it in number 4 through focus groups. And they also use the word analyze, right? And they use the word data or answers. They're analyzing this data. I would also argue that number 2 is not research because it's not taking an empirical stance, which we'll get to in a moment. It's advocating for something. It's pushing for a particular viewpoint, which is different than the general goal of research is to pose a question of interest, collect data on it, and analyze it in an as objective way as possible. And for number 1, I think we might need a little bit of more information to say that it is research, but just from this single statement, it's not really clear that they are collecting data. It might be helpful to learn about such a program, but it's unlikely to be found in a research report. So the scientific approach, we can define this as an objective set of rules for gathering, evaluating, and reporting information. And obviously in this course, we'll be focusing on what that scientific approach looks like in HDF, but this certainly varies by discipline. And we can also think about the advantages of such a scientific approach is that it is objective, that it does use data and document the use of data, but also a couple things that might not be obvious from that definition is that the scientific approach involves researchers working together, researchers collaborating and building off of previous knowledge, and also peer review. And I wanted to just review this concept of peer review. So peer review is really important in science, and particularly we're going to be reading a number of peer-reviewed journal articles in this class. We'll read some as a class, and then you'll read some other ones through your own projects. And peer review is this process by which a scientist or a group of researchers works on a research report together. They submit it to a journal, and then the journal asks other experts in the field to review the research and review it in terms of how valuable is this research, how is the methodology, do their results make sense, all sorts of things. But the key thing is this idea of scientific approach being collaborative, that you don't work in a vacuum. Researchers like myself, when I do some research, I send it out because I want it to be published. Other experts in the field take a look at it, give me feedback, we have this dialogue. Also, this how scientists communicate findings. Where we can find research reports, again, is outlined in chapter 1 of our textbook. But just to be sort of a broad understanding of this, we might think about publications, we might think about interpersonal communications, and we might also think about professional presentations as sort of the big 3 areas how scientists communicate their findings. And clearly we can also make this connection between peer review, and if we go back to the previous slide, of this scientific approach, right, and the advantages of it. The next thing I want to talk about is this word empirical, and being able to distinguish between something that's empirical, an empirical statement, and something normative. So something empirical is something that can be measured or observed. And that's what we're focusing on in this class. That's what researchers care about, which is different from a normative statement that is a value judgment, that talks about what should be, what ought to be. And maybe you read some research papers, and maybe at the very end of the paper they might make a suggestion for public policy, but overall they're trying to write and they're trying to present their information in such a way that it's empirical. I'm going to say this, and it can be measured or observed. So a few examples of this. On the left column is a normative statement, on the right is an empirical. So normative statement, again, uses the should word, saying something like, people with criminal records should not be allowed to live in public housing, which is different than making an empirical statement on a similar topic. The law does not permit people with criminal records to live in public housing. So we could go and find this law and see where it says that, and empirically state, we're not putting a value judgment on it, we're just saying that the law says this. Similarly, if I make a statement like, my students are better than your students, that still sounds kind of judgy, right? But we can make an empirical statement, we can back up the statement with data, right? We can show objectively that students in class A have higher average GPAs than students in class B. So I would ask, what I would ask you to do, again, you're going to need to pause the video, is take a look at these 3 normative statements and these 3 empirical statements. And choose one of the normative statements and change it to an empirical statement. And just try to use your research imagination and also think, okay, this is sort of, you're making something up, but how could you confirm this with data? Is there a way, can you imagine that there might be survey data or government data or something out there that you could confirm? And similarly, for the empirical statements, see if you can take one of them and convert it to a normative statement. So please pause here. For example, teenagers should not be getting pregnant is a normative statement. It's using that should word. And we could instead say that the teenage pregnancy rate is higher in the United States than it is in France. And we could look at public health data or census data from each of the countries, say, okay, how many teenagers got pregnant in 2013, compare the rates between the 2 years, and we could back that up with data. We're not necessarily putting a value judgment on it, right? Oh, should be, shouldn't be, but being able to compare the two. So that's one example. For empirical, let's say the last one, the statement, a growing number of young adults live with their parents. Again, you can imagine there's some data out there that looks at that, comparing 1985 to 2015. And to turn that into a normative statement, we could say something like, young people shouldn't live with their parents. They should be able to take care of themselves, for example. All right, so that concludes our first video lecture.